Plantlife is the global voice for plants and fungi. Plants and fungi, as you are all going to know, you're going to be very, very well aware. Plants and fungi are the building blocks of our ecosystems. Without plants and without fungi, we wouldn't have life, essentially. There wouldn't be anything. They're the primary producers. Plants capture sunlight, turn it into energy, and they're the building blocks for everything else. So they really are the fundamental pieces of our ecosystems. They're in trouble all over the world, and Plantlife is, as it says here, the global voice for wild plants and fungi. So all over the world, we're standing up for plants and fungi. But as I always say, I'm very biased. I've got the best job because I get to look after what we do in Scotland. So one of the key things that we do in Scotland is focus on our grasslands. So we've got a range of different programs which we focus on, and one of the key things at the moment is really trying to raise awareness of and take action for Scotland's grasslands. It's really, really good to be here. So that's what I'm going to be talking to you about this morning. And really, it's an opportunity to, do I just click this to move it on? Ah, cool. Or I could use this. I could use the mouse. I could just use the mouse. Yeah, just go with that. Yeah, cool. All right. So for that. Yeah, so we're talking about Scotland's grasslands. And it's a really good excuse on a chilly November morning to remind ourselves what a species-rich grassland, what a wildflower meadow is. And when you walk into a wildflower meadow, and you guys will be well aware of this, when you walk into a wildflower meadow in the middle of the summer, it can be a really overwhelming kind of experience. You're hit with colours, you're hit with sounds, you're hit with smells. You see the amazing variety and the diversity of wildflowers. You smell the smell of the wildflowers and the grasses. You hear the hum and the buzz of the insects and the birds overhead. And grasslands really are one of our most diverse, exciting, and important habitats. So when I'm setting the scene for talks about species-rich grasslands, sometimes that's as far as I'll go. But I reckon with you guys, I can go a little bit techier and a little bit geekier. I won't jump into MVC types, I promise. But when we talk about grasslands, it's quite important to be able to define what we mean. So for Plantlife, and essentially for grassland conservation across the UK, there are 5 broad habitat types associated with grasslands. So that's your lowland acid grassland, your lowland and upland calcareous grasslands, lowland meadows, and upland hay meadows. So some of those are, or at least used to be, quite widespread, and some of them are very, very restricted in their distribution. Things like upland hay meadows, we have very, very few of in Scotland. So those are the broad habitat types that we're talking about when we talk about grasslands. Then there are other more specialist habitat types as well, which we include in our definition. So that's things like grazing marsh, things like purple moor pasture, Calmanarian grasslands, which are associated with very, very specific geologies and which are very, very limited in distribution. And then grasslands that have a significant woodland component as well, like orchards, wood pasture, and parkland. They're all really, really important and really, really species diverse. Not just the wildflowers, as we've said, hugely important for pollinators, for a whole range of invertebrates, and diversity both above the ground and below ground diversity as well. And it's amazing the number of species that you can get in even just 1 square metre of species-rich grassland. And it's not just those things, they are one of the most important things that we're starting to learn a lot more about now is grassland fungi. So the UK has some of the most important populations of waxcap fungi anywhere. And we're really just at the start of the journey trying to understand and learn about how important fungi are in our grassland ecosystems and our ecosystems more generally across a whole range of different habitats. So hugely important, hugely diverse, and really, really amazing places to be. So what are these habitats and where did they come from? Well, we think these days of grasslands, wildflower meadows, pastures as being a product of the interaction between people and nature, predominantly through agriculture, because as we know, most of these grasslands rely on that kind of intervention through cutting and grazing, or a combination of the two. And that certainly is true today. But where do they come from? They can't always have relied on those interactions. And it's amazing, actually, if you take a journey back in time, if you were to jump into a time machine and go back 70,000 years into the pollen record, then you would be able to see combinations of species, assemblages of species that would look really, really familiar to us today. There are some very shade-tolerant species within that assemblage all those years ago, but some very shade-intolerant species as well that must have needed the light in order to be able to survive and thrive. So way back in the past, we can kind of surmise that the vegetation cover wouldn't have been wall-to-wall woodland. It would have been much, much patchier, more like a mosaic. And of course it would have been. There would always have been disturbance caused by large herbivores crashing through the forest fires, there would have been storm damage, and in some parts of the world, landslides and avalanches as well, creating very open and disturbed habitat. And the species which we think of as wildflower meadow species today would have taken advantage of that disturbance. They're very, very disturbance tolerant. They would have moved in and been parts of this dynamic system. So that's what happened way back in the past. From Neolithic times onwards, humans started to clear that wildwood, and the plant species obviously didn't differentiate between that disturbance and the natural disturbance of all those natural kinds of events. And so the species started to interact with and build up relationships with humans. And eventually we got to the point where wildflower meadows and species-rich pasture were a huge part of our agricultural systems. They knitted themselves into not just our agricultural systems, but they really kind of stitched themselves into our culture more broadly as well, into our literature, to our songs, our poems. They were just was part of life. They were just always there in the background. They were always there. Until one day, they weren't. And it was around about the 1950s that we started to experience the most catastrophic loss of species-rich grasslands across the UK. And it's been called the greatest failure of the UK's conservation movement. So that was in the 1950s that that loss really, really started. And we'll go on to explore a little bit about why. But the UK's conservation movement had been on the go for a good length of time prior to that. It was really the early 20th century that we started to see the wildlife trusts form and early RSPB. And people were really busy. They were saving ancient woodland, they were saving wetlands, they were saving rare species, but nobody thought about saving species-rich grasslands, wildflower meadows. They were just always there. They were part of our agricultural systems. They were always there. So we started to experience catastrophic loss. It was really in the 80s and the 90s that people started to pick up on this and realize what was going wrong. And then when we got into the 2000s, you've probably seen this statistic. Headlines like this started to appear. 97% of meadows lost in the last 100 years. And everybody started using that statistic then. Certainly Plantlife have used it in the past. I think a whole load of environmental organisations have used it. Even The Guardian was using it about 10 years ago. Chris Packham, everybody was using this statistic. So what we thought in Plantlife when we started to get serious about grasslands was we'd better try and unpick this statistic to make sure we really knew that it was robust and what was sitting behind it rather than just repeat it. Because it's really, really important to have that evidence. We'll talk a bit more about that. Because when you're up against politicians, when you're up against developers, or when you're up against people that don't have the best interests of wildlife at heart, then you really, really need to have the facts at your fingertips. So 97% of grasslands lost in the last 100 years. It's interesting. It's very, very catchy. But what does it actually mean? And where did it come from? And when did that happen? And is that still happening now? So we started to dig into a little bit. We got a little bit more or less on the case. We didn't actually get in touch with the Radio 4 program that digs into statistics, but we tried to really unpick what was behind that stat. And when you start to follow the thread back, it's actually quite difficult to find out where it comes from. One reference leads to another reference, leads to another reference, but eventually you can find where it comes from. And that statistic comes from one paper, which was published in 1987 by a chap called Fuller. And it's very, very specific. It relates to unimproved lowland pasture, excluding rough grassland in England and Wales. So it was from that 97% statistic had been extrapolated. And obviously, that's a snapshot in time, and it doesn't really cover everything that we're talking about. So is it a good statistic? Is it something that we should be using? Well, it's very, very difficult to get a handle on because our records and our understanding of species-rich grassland, its status and condition, aren't very well recorded. But we think that that's a significant underestimate. Nature Scott reckoned that 16% of priority grassland habitats have been lost since 1983, and we've seen lowland meadow being the highest loss within that priority grassland, or those priority grassland types that we saw earlier. So what do we think if we were speaking to Tim Harford at Radio 4? I would say probably more than 97% have been lost over the last 100 years, but with the variable rate of decline in different parts of the UK, no indication that this trend is being reversed. And if current trends continue, if the current rate of loss continues, then we're going to lose all our lowland species-rich grassland by the end of the century. So that's what we're up against. So why is this happening? Essentially, it comes down to a range of factors, the biggest one being the intensification of farming practices. So that amazing species-rich grassland that we saw at the start, they are being ploughed up, they're being reseeded, and they're being fertilized, and you end up with this bright green field of monoculture. And that's what we're replacing them with. The farmers are responding to market pressures and advances in technology and production, but essentially this is what's happening. And that was the main driver of loss. Overgrazing is very much associated with that as well. Nitrogen pollution is a significant factor in the loss of species-rich grasslands and the way that they're changing. Essentially, that's either from local pollution sources, things like ammonia from agriculture, or atmospheric nitrogen pollution from industry. And essentially what nitrogen is, it's a massive fertilizer. It's a very, very effective fertilizer. And what we do when we pollute systems with nitrogen is we just dump a whole load of fertilizer onto these habitats which thrive in and need very, very low nutrient conditions. So nitrogen pollution is a disaster for these habitats. Land abandonment, when agriculture isn't functioning anymore, where it's not viable, is as much of a problem as the intensification of agriculture, and then these systems revert to scrubland and they lose the important species. Inappropriate tree planting is not going to go away, so that's where grasslands are ploughed up and Sitka spruce and other commercial plantations come in, often in response to very, very challenging planting targets around net zero. That's a significant issue, and that's really ramping up in terms of the impacts that it's having. And underpinning all of these things, it's a limited understanding and awareness of the importance of grasslands. So this is the kind of things that we're seeing and why they're causing this loss. So it's not just about land cover, it's about the species as well. So you could have a calcareous grassland and protect it and make sure that nobody plows it up or turns it into a housing estate, but you could still be losing that grassland slowly over time. And that's because the species diversity is declining within those grasslands. So BSBI do a huge amount of work gathering records that's been synthesized now into this Plant Atlas 2020, which I'm sure you've seen, which is an amazing resource which helps us to understand how the fortunes of species change over time. In this graph on the left-hand side here, it shows us the long-term trends of the frequency of grassland species in 3 grassland types: in neutral grassland, acid grassland, and calcareous grassland. And you can see they're on the downward trend. So even if those grasslands remained, the species within them are disappearing. Species like this frog orchid declined by over 50%. Species like this, globe flower, again, really, really struggling in parts of its range. And then species like this that have naturally got a very, very restricted range. This is the Scottish primrose, which you only find in Caithness and Sutherland and Orkney. It's been lost from at least 75 of its sites in recent years. So these are amazing species. They're really, really special species. They're charismatic, they're beautiful, and we're losing them quickly. But we've got protected sites, surely, don't we? We've got triple SIs, we've got sites of special scientific interest. Surely they are going to help stem this loss. And it's true that when people did start to pick up on this catastrophic loss, particularly during the 80s, there was a flurry of activity around designating sites, around identifying the last bits of species-rich grassland and protecting them. But that's not really how nature works, and it's certainly not how species-rich grasslands work. So when we look at the condition of those triple SIs, grasslands are experiencing the second lowest proportion of features in favourable condition. Nearly half of grassland triple SIs are in some form of unfavourable condition, and there are different categories within that. And just as importantly, since 2010, 37% of grassland triple SIs haven't been monitored. So the situation could be even worse than that. So protected sites struggle, and that's because when they were designated, it really was a case of protecting the last little remnants. And that's not how grasslands work. That's not how grasslands function. This is a triple SI called Weem Meadow up in Highland Perthshire near Aberfeldy. And it is an upland hay meadow, one of those really rare upland hay meadows. And in the past, it wouldn't have existed just as an isolated fragment of habitat. It would have been interconnected with its surrounding landscape. There would have been a series or a chain of meadows and grasslands up and down the river. This is the River Tay here. And there would also have been connectivity with the surrounding landscape, both through people moving and then moving seeds around and moving plant material around, and also through the agricultural systems with livestock moving. So this is down in the valley floor. And then up here, about 10 miles up into the mountains, beyond Aberfeldy, this is the little patch of species-rich grassland next to a shieling. And what used to happen is the cattle were overwintered in the meadows down next to the river, and then the meadow was shut up. Cattle were taken up into the mountains for the summer. The people would live in the shielings, and that connectivity created by the cattle and the people moving between the sites allowed genetic material to move, and it allowed these sites to function and be very, very resilient. So that's what happened in the past, and that is Weem Meadow today. Tiny little fragment of species-rich grassland, isolated in a sea of intensive agriculture and commercial forestry. And what that means is that it's going to go through a horrific genetic bottleneck. And even if the species is still there today, because they're not receiving that genetic material and allowing that interbreeding, which gives them the genetic resilience, they carry what's called an extinction debt, which means that in time, those species will go extinct as well. So just protecting those little fragments isn't enough. So that's all the problems. It's quite depressing, but there are things we can do about it. And we've been looking into this and really trying to come up with a series of recommendations of what needs to happen to turn this around. And there are things that we can do. So a lot of this talk is based on this report. It's called Machair to Meadows, and it's a report that we've just recently published over the summer. That's the website if you want to get to the report, but if you just Google Plantlife Machair to Meadows, you'll get the report. I think it's the first thing that comes up. And what we do in this report is explore a lot of the data, a lot of the evidence that sits behind all these trends, but also make a series of recommendations as to what needs to happen in the future. And there's a whole load of things in there. There's a lot of policy recommendations. There's recommendations around improved legislation, around financial incentives for farmers. But the ones that I wanted to focus on today were around monitoring the evidence base and protection. So that atlas that we saw earlier, the BSBI atlas, that is the result of 30 million records that people like you and me been out in the field gathering, made it through the BSBI data collection and analysis processes, put into this amazing publication, and then I can use that when I'm speaking to politicians, when I'm speaking to people and trying to persuade them about the value of species-rich grassland and the evidence, then I can use this. So one of the most important things is to keep those records coming in so that we've got the evidence base and we know what's happening. So that's a big part of what we do. So a big part of what we do at Plantlife is getting out into the field and training people and getting people excited. So there's a whole range of events and activities that we've got going on here. And I'm sure some of you will recognise the chap delivering the training here. That's Ben Averis, delivering training on species-rich grassland up in the Highlands for us this summer. And of all the people who come on these events, some of them will just be interested and go away learning a little bit more, knowing a little bit more about grassland. Some of them will turn into pretty enthusiastic botanists, and some of them might turn into the Vice County recorders of the future. So it's really, really important to keep this going, this series of training. It's not just all about identification, though. If your thing isn't identification, then it's all about practical management as well. And what we're doing here, and this was a scything event, which we ran up in the Cairngorms, was to try and replicate those traditional land management practices which have been lost, which in themselves, as we've seen, were replicating those natural processes away back in the history of time. So getting out and actually practically managing meadows is a huge part of what we do. And then another big thing is advice and working with farmers to make sure that all that data that we're gathering, all that understanding about the way species are changing and responding to land management is actually getting back to the people who can do something about it on the ground, which is the land managers, it is the farmers. So at the moment, we're part of a project called Species on the Edge, and we're working up on the north coast in Caithness and Sutherland, in Orkney, Shetland, and out on the Outer Hebrides as well, to work with farmers, put together land management plans, and to help farmers through the tricky and complex process of applying for agricultural environment funding to actually try and get these sites into some sort of good condition. And we're not doing that on our own. A big part of Species on the Edge is working with our conservation partners. So the last thing we want when we're giving a farmer advice is for Plantlife to be knocking on the door, and a couple of days later, butterfly conservation knocking on the door, then bumblebee conservation. So what we're trying to do is collaborate and make sure that we've just got one point where farmers can obtain the necessary information that they need and the help to manage these incredible places. This is the Machair. This is actually taken on Battersea on the Outer Hebrides. But some of these grasslands are some of our most species-rich, beautiful, beautiful Machair and coastal grasslands that we've got up there. Oh, and I threw this in. This is a kelp bed. This is just to make the point again about that connection, those connections between sites, which don't just happen on land, but which happen on sea as well. So the kelp beds offshore next to the Machair, some of that kelp gets washed up onto the beach. Some of it is taken and applied to the Machair, which creates really, really good conditions for species to grow in. And also the kelp beds themselves provide significant level of protection against winter storms. When you've got huge surf coming in off the North Atlantic, the kelp beds absorb an awful lot of that energy, protect the grasslands. So these connections that we're talking about and that we're learning about don't just happen on land, they happen between the land and the sea as well. But we can't all be up in the northwest, up in the Outer Hebrides. And the great thing about grasslands is that we can all take action for grasslands wherever we are. And some of the most important refuges for grasslands are now our road verges and our green spaces. So Plantlife run No Mow May, trying to encourage people to keep the mower in the shed at least for the month of May to let plants flower. But we're kind of extending that to let it bloom June and knee-high July as well. Really, the idea is just to try and, just calm down with the mowing. And it seems to be working. People are getting behind it, and as a movement, it does seem to be growing. And apart from anything else, it raises awareness of the importance of grasslands. So if you're up for trying that, definitely encourage you, if you've got some green space, to keep the mower in the shed, or to encourage your local council to do the same and look after their road verges and their green spaces. And if you're worried about what the neighbours think, then you can download some signs from the Plantlife website and explain what you're doing. And road verges are really, really important. There's incredibly rare species that are found on road verges, and those plants that all those years ago came out of the wildwood, because of this intensification of agriculture and the way that plants are being forced into ever narrowing spaces, road verges have become some of the last refuges for some of our most important plants. So we do an awful lot with councils. One of the interesting things that we're doing, and this gets very, very technical, is try to work out how to make that management carbon neutral. So road verges do need to be cut. They need to be cut at the end of the year. And one of the concerns that councils have is that's pretty expensive, and where's all that funding going to come from? What we've been doing is working through a project called Live Labs to essentially try and decarbonize local roads. This is very, very technical. I don't really claim to understand it, but our road verges manager does. Essentially, you take those cuttings, if you cut at the right time of year, at the end of the year, the end of the autumn, then you can then put those cuttings through an anaerobic digestion system. A whole load of complicated processes happen. Out the other end comes biomethane fuel, which is then used to fuel the machines which cut your road verges. It's meant to be a closed loop system. It's early days and it's very experimental, but we're working with some councils to trial that and see if this is an approach. We can't all get involved in anaerobic digestion. We don't all want to, but what we can do is get out there and record species. If you're interested in finding out more, then one of the things that we're really, really keen to encourage people to do is to get involved in our National Plant Monitoring Scheme, run with Plantlife, BSBI, JNCC. And if you're interested in that, what that does is generate a whole load of that data, which we've been talking about, and which we then use for our campaigning. The blue squares on this map, and it's a square-based system, you adopt a square. The blue squares here are the squares which are available, which are looking for volunteers. So if you're up for adopting a square, visiting once or twice a year and recording the species there, then go onto the NPMS website and have a look. And we can start to see trends like this. The data is hugely important. That's why it's so good to be here today. I think data is the one thing which runs through the whole of this report and what comes out strongly to us. If we don't have the evidence, then we can't make these arguments and we can't bring about that change. To support our local record centres, the NBN, and really one of the things that we're trying to do is support the Better Biodiversity project. We're looking forward to hearing this afternoon about progress with that and make sure that there's funding, sustainable funding in place to enable the flow of information from the field all the way through to decision makers. And what we're doing is we're out there recording species like this, and this, this, and this. And hopefully, if we do that in places like this, we'll have a lot more of this. Thanks very much.